welcome to The Art of Being Human. We've been working with grief, and I've been talking to you about grief and bereavement. And so I just want to kind of review some things here, because you may be in a state of grief due to the death of a loved one, or maybe someone's moved away, or maybe you've lost your job, or maybe your house has gone into foreclosure. Anything where there is a loss, there is grief involved with it. Losses give grief. And we normally think of grief as being basically the loss of a loved one, and in many cases that's what it is. And it can be potent and it can be terrible. But there are other things that'll cause grief too. If you've lost a pet, if you've lost somebody by suicide, if you have decided that you have to move, if your area where you're living is going to have a flood or something and you have to evacuate, which is the situation for a lot of people. And so therefore any kind of loss that you have is going to cause grief, and it's hard to handle and it's difficult. So grief is awful and it's intense, and it can be completely overwhelming, completely overcoming, and you cannot stop it. And at the time that you have a grief reaction, there's nothing that can stop it. When you're in that mode, I consider it to be like a special state of being. You have to kind of stay in it until after you get released from it, and then you step out of it for a while. I've noticed for people who are in grief, and it's happened to myself as well, that they go into a state of grief and they're agonizing. The symptoms are agonizing. And then somehow they kind of snap out of it, and then for a while they don't think of it actively and they go about their life and do normal things. And then they're back into it again, in and out, in and out. And that's the way it is with grief. And when you're in it, and when you're in that mode, and when you're anxious about it and you're depressed about it, and you're having those symptoms of grief, which I've described before, both the mental symptoms and the physical symptoms, it just releases itself in a period of time, and you go about your business, and you find that those periods of grief gets less and less and less. When you are like that, remember, when you're in a state of grief, remember that you will ease out of it, and you'll find the periods of your grief less intense and less long, and that your periods of being like a normal human being, doing normal things, get longer. So it's in and out, in and out. And I kind of liken it to surgery, because grief can be like a surgical amputation. But when you have surgery, and I've had a number of surgeries, and most people have, I guess, the healing is like that. You feel terrible for a while, then you start to feel pretty good. And then you feel terrible for a while, and then you start to feel pretty good. And what happens is that you have periods of time where you have symptoms of your surgery and you don't feel good, and then somehow you start to feel better, and the periods of you feeling better are longer and greater and better, and then when you go back into suffering from the surgery, it's less intense and shorter, and gradually you have more good times than you have bad times. And then so that doesn't mean there won't be bad times, but when you do have them, they're less intense, they're less long, and then you get longer periods of feeling better. That's the way you heal from illnesses, and that's how you heal from surgery, and that's also how you heal from grief. And closure is a must. You absolutely need to have closure, because what happens in closure, and a good funeral will do this for you, a poor funeral won't, but if you have a good funeral, and I class them that way, either good or bad funerals, it closes a book and it gives you that closure. You have your final goodbye, and then you're ready to move on with your life. It's like opening another book. It's like opening another chapter of your own book. So it brings things to a close, and then you're ready to move on. And that's what you need. Now, people who don't have funerals, I'm not going to bother with it, I don't like it, it's going to make me suffer too much, I'm going to cry all the time, and they don't have a funeral, their grief, I think, is going to last a lot longer, because there's nothing that gives them that closure. Now, I know people who get into a complicated grief, they don't have closure, and they suffer from that grief, sometimes for years at a time. So to get back to this, you cannot stop the grief, and you can't think of anything else. It completely overwhelms you. Now, It's different than depression. Grief is different than depression. The symptoms are somewhat the same, but they're also different. There's a different kind of feeling tone to grief than there is for depression. For depression, it can be long-acting, it can be dragged out, you feel terrible, you don't feel happy. You know, with grief, you have elements of that, but usually grief is a lot shorter lived, and you start taking back your life within a week or two from what it was before. Your life has changed some, but at least it's life, and you're handling it, and you're moving forward, and you don't have the symptoms of grief in such a terrible way as you did before. The feeling tone is all different. But if you don't have the closure that you need, that from grief, then it can drag on and on and on, and it can lean into and become a major clinical depression. Now, a clinical depression is a lot different than just having a blue day. Most people have days when they're a little depressed, when they're a little blue, and it phases off. But a clinical depression can be disabling because you can be so depressed that you can't function normally, you can't think normally, you can't act normally, you can't go about your normal routine, and it can go on and on and on and on. And for that, you have to have help. Sometimes it'll wear off, and you have periods of time when you feel all right, but it can also return. So if you are in a depression that's more than a normal blue day that you get every so often, and you can't seem to cope with it, and it's bothering you, and it's interfering with your life in some way, then what you need to do is to get help with it, professional help. Because depression, although it's awful, it's something that you don't want to experience, it's something that's very healable. It's very, very conducive to getting better with the proper therapy and the proper medication. You can feel better fairly quickly, and that can remain with you. Now, if you have something like a bipolar 1, bipolar 2, there are 2 types of bipolar, then you can swing up and down, and the depths of the depression are very, very deep. If you don't get out of that depression, then you have what's called a unipolar depression. In other words, you're not cycling. Bipolar means that you're going to cycle way high, way low, more than most people do, although there are different grades of it. But if you have a unipolar depression, you get stuck in the depression and you never get out of it. And so for that, you need medication, you need therapy, you need help. And there's no shame in getting help if you need it. Now, we're dealing with grief, we're not dealing with depression, but the grief can lead into a clinical depression. That's not the same as bipolar, but it is a very difficult thing to deal with, and you may need to have help in getting over it. So emotions are emotions, and I can't say emotions is the same thing as grief, but emotions kick in. When you feel depressed, depression is not an emotion, it's kind of a state of being. Emotions are transitory, they come and they go, but you can feel terribly distraught if you're in a state of grief. And if you want to class that as kind of like an emotional state, I suppose you can. There are some differences. So it's just something that you have to deal with. Now, I'm going to read something to you that I got off the internet this morning, and it's by Warren Buffett. And it talks about emotions, and it talks about being more intellectually inclined. Most people feel that we are intellectual beings, and we just solve problems as they come up and we move on. But most people have a very strong emotional component to what they're experiencing, and they experience the emotions deeply to the point where I think that we are sometimes more emotional than we are intellectual. But I want to read what he said, and you can have your own take on it to see what you think. But he says this is Warren Buffett: "You will continue to suffer if you have an emotional reaction to everything that is said to you. True power is sitting back and observing things with logic. True power is restraint. If words control you, that means that everyone else can control you. Breathe and allow things to pass." Now, I don't know how you feel about this statement. I'm not saying I think it's completely true, but I think that it deserves some attention, because if you think in terms of your emotions only and your grief only, which I'm not classifying grief as an emotion by any means. It's a different kind of state of being, but emotions have a play in it. If you think of emotions, if you live your life according to how you're feeling, instead of living your life in terms of, let's see what this is about, and kind of using an intellectual approach, you can be caught off guard and have intense emotional reactions, which you may not want. But this is a statement that he said. As I said, I don't completely agree with it, but it does bear a point. If you can look at things and allow yourself not to become overly emotional about them, but look at things and have kind of an intellectual approach. And I'm not saying that if that's not your nature, that's not your nature. It might help you not to have so much emotional reaction. When somebody says to you something that's hurtful, your first inclination is to react against it. First to become angry, and then to react emotionally against it. If you can stop and say, well, I'll think about this, maybe there's something to it, then you can maybe change your emotional reaction and not suffer so much, because people suffer from emotions that are difficult to handle. And there has to be a way of handling them so you don't suffer so much. So I present this to you as an idea that you can kind of mull on and see what you think. Now let's get to the signs of a complicated grief. As I said before, if you go through grief stages normally, if you go through grief stages normally, then you will get closure. If you have closure, you can move on and you can heal from the grief. Grief is healable. And I know I've said before that when I do funerals, and I still do them, even though supposedly I'm retired, I say supposedly, when I do funerals, I do it now, I didn't used to. I take a small section of time, not a lot, and talk about healing from the grief, because the people that you're going to see at a funeral, and if you are doing a funeral, what you're going to see is tons and tons of grief and tears and remorse and all kinds of things, which is why people want to stay away from them. But if you can give a little bit of time toward the healing of all of that, which is what I do now in my funerals, people can leave in a much better frame of mind, because you're giving them hope. You are now in a state of grief, but grief can be healed. You can get the closure that you need. You can move on. Life might not be the same, but it can still be good. You can still accomplish a lot of things. You can still have a reasonably normal kind of life. You can regroup. You can just go on and become a healthy person and even a happy person. So it's not like the grief has to be with you forever. I know in clinical depressions, and I think also in grief, one element that's similar between them, and as I said before, they're not the same thing and the symptoms present differently, but one element that is similar between them is the fact that you think you're never going to get out of it. If a person has a deep, deep grief, they're fearful that they're always going to be grieving. Now, if the grief becomes complicated, they will be grieving for long periods of time. If they have a normal grief and move through it like they should move through it, then it's not going to last for a long, long time. It will eventually resolve, and then you live your life again. If you go into a complicated grief, it can be terrible, and it can last for a long time, sometimes even years. Now, I know that I've read that for mental hospitals, people who go to mental hospitals, they are brought there because of their mental health. A lot of it, for some people that are admitted to a mental hospital, it's because that they have unresolved grief issues, and it keeps returning and returning and returning. And that's because it's a complicated grief. Now, depression, you oftentimes fear that you're not going to get out of it. But you do get out of it because it's cyclical. If you're in a deep kind of a depression and you have that fear that you're never going to get out of this depression and it's going to be for the rest of your life, you can comfort yourself with the knowledge that that's one of the symptoms, and that when you start to lift up, that will go away like all of the other symptoms will go away. Some people are very, very cyclical. And I will tell them that they have a cyclical disorder. And what that means is they're high, they're low. They're high, they're low. Maybe not to the point where they have a bipolar reaction, but at the same time, they're going to go high and low because that's the nature. They're going to cycle. And when they're low, I keep telling them, just tell yourself when you're low that you're going to get out of it, because you always do. And it's only going to last for a certain period of time. You're going to lift up, and when you lift up, all of those symptoms, including the fear that you're never going to get out of it, will leave. And you'll look back on those symptoms and say, why did I think that? Why did I feel that? I don't feel that now. And that's a sign of your recovery. But if you keep on going through it cyclically, on and on and on, then you need to get help with it. Because as I said before, depression and all of its symptoms can be resolved with good therapy and can be resolved with some medication or a combination of the two. And you can feel much, much better, and you can be much, much better. And the same holds true of grief. If you're grief-stricken and you think it's running too long, or you know it's running too long and you just can't seem to get out of it, well, then all you have to do is get the help with it, and it can resolve. You can get help. You're not stuck. I think one of the fears that people have when they go through anxiety and depression and grief, they're afraid of getting stuck and not ever moving out of it. For people who have physical conditions in which anxiety is one of the symptoms, they're going to fear that they'll never get out of the symptoms. Knowing that they can, with the proper help, get out of them gives them hope. And when you have hope, things are automatically better. And I think sometimes it's wise to share a diagnosis. If you're a counselor, share the diagnosis with your person that you're seeing, with your counselee. Because if they have something to hold on to, yes, this is a symptom. It's only a symptom. It's going to resolve as the other symptoms resolve. That gives them some hope, and I think it makes it easier to heal. To know what's wrong with you, and I used to tell clients this all the time, why do I have to know what's wrong with me? If you know what's wrong, and if you know what your diagnosis is, and I'm not saying that's appropriate with every single person that is in therapy, but it's appropriate for quite a few. If they know what they're dealing with and they can have a handle on it, oh yes, this is what it is, and it's repeating itself, but it's going to get better. It does give hope, and it makes, I think, healing easier. So let's get to the signs of complicated grief. If you are withdrawing from relationships, withdrawing from normal activities that especially that were associated with the deceased, and I think that it's normal to stay away from things that you're deceased and you did together, at least for a while. And then if you want to go back to it, fine. You may need to create a new reality. You know, I see people who have lost people close to the Christmas holidays, and Christmas is never the same. My own father died 3 weeks before Christmas, and my great-grandmother died 3 days before that. So I had 2 deaths within 3 days, all 3 weeks before Christmas. So what do? Or what about a divorce? When you've lost somebody through a divorce and you have children and Christmas time comes and there's no dad around or there's no mom around. What you need to do is to create a new reality. Have a new set of things that you do. You know, usually you have a certain set of things that you do. You go Thanksgiving dinner, and then you go back to see Grandma at Christmas time, and there are gifts, and you go to a certain movie or you do a certain thing. People have their rituals that they go through during the holidays, and they repeat those rituals every year. And that's fine as long as the family is intact. If the family is not intact anymore and there's a real problem, then how do you do it? How do you handle it? You create a new set of things to do. You create a new set of rituals. Like, for example, I told one family, you have a pizza night. Instead of going to that certain movie with your dad, which you did for years and years, now there's no dad in the picture or there's no mom in the picture. Why not have a pizza night? Why not view some kind of a special show that you like, maybe not the same one that you're used to, but something else, something that's funny, something you can laugh at while eating pizza. I mean, there are all kinds of things that you can do that are different, that create a different kind of ritual for the holidays than what you had before, because what you had before doesn't work anymore. And you can get over it, and that's kind of a ritual, a kind of a closure by itself as well. Well, I see we're getting out of time, and I really want to get into the weeks and the months that you may have of complicated grief reactions, but I don't want to start it right now because I'll get in the middle of it and then we'll have to close the show. So I'm going to close the show now, and we'll do this next time. And on the screen we have the Veterans Crisis and Suicide Hotline, 1-800-273-8255. And then the Domestic Violence Hotline for New Hampshire. This may not work if you're out of state, but 866-664-3574. And I'm going to keep that up for every show that I do on grief, bereavement, which will be followed by some shows on suicidology, because suicidology has become a big problem. Many, many more people attempting suicide, veterans attempting suicide. And so I want to put that up at least once every show while we go through these next few shows. So we'll close it here. Please join me next time.